Right, guys, welcome back to episode 3 of season 2 of my podcast, Ambitious Odyssey. I am extremely grateful to have an amazing guest with me today, someone who I've just linked over social media, specifically Instagram. Dialectic, would you like to introduce yourself to the people?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me on here. It's an absolute pleasure. My name is Dialectic. I am a hip hop artist, a poet, and a writer from Toronto, Canada. And yeah.
I love it, man. It's super cool to meet like-minded people, and me and you specifically, I think the reason why I connected with you because we both share the same love and fondness of Malcolm X. And your Instagram page is just littered with gems about Malcolm, just sharing snippets of his life. So that's what really interested me in the first place. Would you like to just talk about what attracted you to Malcolm in the first place, and why he's been such an inspiration to you so far?
Definitely. I think, and that's the beautiful thing about, someone like Malcolm X and his life story is that wherever you speak to people, you'll at least find someone who shares, in understanding his story, but that it's impacted them in the same way as it has done for you. And just, in general, Malcolm and his life story is something that's very profound and powerful for whoever comes across it, because he kind of, provides an insight and a sort of, just a model of how you can lift yourself up. And it's not just about the fact that he was, a Black revolutionary, someone who's engaged in a struggle to lift up his own people, but that, self-empowerment, I think that attribute was something that really attracted me to his story. And it doesn't necessarily have to be only for, the sort of, downtrodden person that the oppressed can only take from his story. I think it's something that applies to, everyday people, because you find yourself so, deeply affected when you read his autobiography. And from there on, it really inspires you to kind of be more conscious. That I doubt somebody can read it and they would say that they aren't going to become more politically engaged or active within their own community, because it really instills that inside of you. So for me personally, that's what he has done. He's provided that sort of revolutionary pathway. And as I was discussing earlier with you, as Muslim, it's something that is hugely inspiring, because we have this sort of prophetic tradition, but it's always difficult to apply those attributes in our modern lifestyle. But I think he provides that example for us for what's possible and how we should be, sort of model individuals who are able to, exemplify that tradition that has been passed on to us.
I couldn't have said that better myself. Everything you just said, I agree with. I remember reading the biography when I was about 15 years old. I was going through a weird transition, the transition from going from obviously what you guys high school, we call secondary school, to going on to my, college years. And I didn't necessarily get the best grades. And I was just trying to figure out my place in the world, and reading his story kind of just, like, as you stated, exemplified that, I think the main thing I took away was Allah's mercy, how, Allah's so merciful, he can take you from one position to another, and he kind of just changed the scope of his life. He was, everything in the book. Then, he was able to make Hajj, which many, very little people could say. So it kind of just instilled in me that confidence to just go after everything. And because I know Allah will ultimately help me, man. And it's beautiful that you just said that, because I agree with everything. As you stated, you're a writer, you're hip hop artist. We want to hear more music. I heard the latest track, fire, absolute fire. I want to hear more. I want to hear LP. Are you working on that at the moment, or are you obviously due to COVID?
Yes, yeah. So I have been working on it for quite some time, and the plan originally was, release it during the early spring, but yeah, it's just been very hectic, and things haven't been lining up because there's just been delays all around with the whole COVID situation, obviously affecting everything, right? So I put it on hold for now, in particular, because of, I think, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with right now, especially, about police brutality and anti-Black violence in the US. I think I don't want to detract too much from that, that central issue at the moment. So I'm definitely putting it on hold. Inshallah, maybe by the end of the summer, I can have, a release date, if not release it by the end of the summer. But it's just about ready to go in terms of the release.
Inshallah, man. And I respect you for that a lot. There's so much happening in the world. Every day you wake up to a new story, and I respect you for, just taking your time. And, the more time you take, the better it sounds. So I can't wait. You got a fan over here, man. I'm up here supporting you. And also,
thank you.
You're welcome, bro. You also do writing. You write for different publications, which I love to see. I love to see a young brother, going to different places. Very motivational. I'm trying to write too, but I'm not on your level yet. Nowhere close. Hopefully someday.
I mean, that's all it is, right? Just writing as much as you can. Just keep at it, and things, line up.
Thank you, bro. Do you have any advice? Just keep on writing?
Yeah, I would say, for me personally, like just like having this sort of brain dump where you just process your thoughts on paper, as well as, just trying to expand your vocabulary in terms of reading a thesaurus, a dictionary, as basic as it seems. I think that's very important, and it's also vital. Like I can't, stress this enough, that you have to be reading in order to become a better writer. I think people usually see that, okay, maybe just for the writing component, it's all it is writing as much as you can, and trying to structure that. But I think it's equally, if not even more so, important to be reading as much as you can, and having a diverse range of material that you're engaging with. That if it's articles, if it's essays, books, and topics that you're interacting with, that's very important as well. Yeah.
Amazing tip, man. And that's another thing which we kind of bonded over. I kind of bonded over is our love for reading. I've been reading ever since I was like 5, 6. I emigrated to the UK when I was about 5, 6. So my English had to be developed, and I used to just spend most of my time during breaks in the library trying to learn about the different cultures, trying to learn about sports, so I could like engage with people. And seeing coming across someone as yourself who's very well read, I must say, across different variety of issues, I was like, okay, this is someone that's very like-minded. That's what motivated me to even reach out to you in the first place and be like, oh man, I want to have you on my podcast. And you were very courteous. Much love. So the main topic of the podcast, I don't want to be too intense. I don't want to sound like I'm at the forefront of the issue, is about Yemen, the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II. Currently 80% of the population is impacted, which is around 12 million children. COVID has only made it worse. Yemen is basically on the brink of just being like wiped off the planet, which is something I don't really quite get. It's 2020, and not even I think Middle East, but the whole world has failed Yemen. And I wanted to get your opinion on some of the intricacies about what's really going on and why it's going on.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very complex, issue and situation, and it's something that's been I think the way we interact with a lot of these, moments and instances of, war or just catastrophe, is that we see them as, it's like sort of like a social media trend or a fad that goes
Facts.
on for a week, and then we're back at, whatever we define as normal. But the
Facts.
fact is that, what's been happening in Yemen, and that it's the world's worst humanitarian crisis at the moment, didn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It didn't just happen overnight. It's something that's been building up for the past 4 or 5 years, if not longer. And I think
Yeah.
it's important, again, to contextualize the sort of powder keg that's been brewing and building up, and then you have this disaster that you're seeing at the moment, right? And it's, you have to go back to 2011, essentially, when you had the Arab Spring uprisings across the region. And you had this man in power in Yemen at that moment, Ali Abdul Saleh, right? And he was a dictator. He'd been there since 1990, and he was a totalitarian, authoritative ruler who the people did not like, right? And he'd this, iron fist rule over the country for nearly 2 decades, if not longer. But the thing that he had, accomplished through his dictatorship was that he kept the country united. And before he came to power in 1990, the reason actually that he came to power was that he unified Yemen. So you had North Yemen and South Yemen. Before that, there were 2 separate countries. First established in, I believe it was the 60s, right? And from there on, then he was able to, unify that as a solitary unified Yemen. So the situation started deteriorating because, you had these active uprisings across the region, and Yemenis felt that they could, replicate some of the successes, quote unquote successes, because obviously we've seen, counter revolutions take place in the same context as, places like Egypt. But what ended up happening was that they drove out Saleh from power, and you actually had that being the first instance where the Saudi Arabia and their Gulf allies, the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, I think, and they basically negotiated with, the Yemeni people, and they brokered this sort of peaceful, arrangement. They're like, we're gonna keep all the parties happy, so we're bringing in this the vice president. I forgot his first name, but his name is Hadi, and they brought him to power. Right? And so he sort of, made this sort of consensus with the Yemeni people, and he said things would change. But, within the next 2-3 years, it was evident that you had the same military elites in power. There was the same sort of repression, instability, a lot of economic strife, which had, first given rise to the uprisings against Saleh. The same thing was happening here. And so there was, again, this sort of instability brewing, and much of it has to do with the fact that, Yemen had been, still is, the poorest country in the region, especially when you look at the, surrounding Gulf area, and you have countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, which are relatively wealthy and obviously, well-to-do. They have modern infrastructures and whatnot. But from there on, you had Hadi being driven out of power, and he was driven out to Saudi Arabia, and you had the Houthis, who were from, I believe, the north, which is a predominant Shia area.
Shia area.
Yeah. So you had this minority community and sort of organization. I guess they're militarily equipped and trained, right?
Yeah.
And in 2014, they were also involved in the previous uprisings in 2011, but
Yeah.
they partnered with the former supporters of
Salah.
Ali Abdullah Saleh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in 2014-15, you see them coming together, and they took the capital city back
Yeah.
then, and from there on the Saudis became involved, and the Gulf Council, they wanted to obviously return their guy Hadi to power. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it has to do with, one, protecting their own regional or sorry actually protecting their own national security. They have
Yeah.
share a large border with Yemen in the south, so
Yeah.
they wanted to protect that. And secondly, they wanted to contain Iran, because this has been
Yes.
something that's been brewing for decades, right? Where you have Iran and Saudi Arabia, facing off in these quote unquote proxy wars.
Uh-huh.
You saw the same thing in Syria, which is
Oh.
again still going on, but largely forgotten about. You had instances of this Shia Sunni clash in Iraq after the sort of
Yeah.
fragment that took place after the American invasion in 2003. So I think wherever you look across the region in the past 20, 30, if not even longer years, you see this hostility between the two. And it
Mm-hmm.
goes back to it goes back to the origins of both these countries, because the US and Saudi Arabia have had a long-standing relationship that's based around shared economic interests. Obviously,
Yes.
they're trade partners in terms of oil, but that
Mm-hmm.
means they also protect each other's regional interests. And
Yes.
with Iran, where the problems largely surfaced were in 1952, actually, where you had Iran be electing a very pro sort of socialist individual in the form of Mohammad Mossadegh, and he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil, which would have been detrimental to U.S. interests and British and
Mm-hmm.
American companies who had a foothold on the distribution of Iranian oil.
Wow.
So they actually, they ran him out of power. They installed the Shah, who was, a brutal authoritarian monarch. And that was, a period which for the US and Iran was, a very fruitful in terms of, sharing that sort of economic relationship and whatnot. But
Right.
from there on, that again, that sort of hostility towards the monarchy was again building up, and you had the 1979 revolution, which Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power, and they sort of implement this new Islamic / revolutionary ideology. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's something at that moment which really, really scared the Saudis, because they too are a monarchy. They too are,
Yeah.
kind of pro-Western at the moment, and they
Yeah.
felt that whatever happens, they have to quell this Iranian threat in the region. And so
Right.
Saudi Arabia, they have this Wahhabi ideology, which they center in their the way they rule, they administer religious, social, every aspect of life is revolves around their religious identity that's rooted in this extremely dictatorial version of Islam. And so they started exporting this ideology all across the region, North Africa, Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the
Mm-hmm.
subcontinent. and they were investing in madrasas, in different infrastructure, essentially to stamp out not just any sort of Iranian influence, but have a stronghold in terms of their
Yep.
own ideology. And so they've always had this hostility. You have the Iran-Iraq War in the late 80s and early 90s. Then you have where they backed Saddam Hussein, right? The Americans backed Saddam Hussein back then against Iran, and so did the Saudis. And that sort of, shifts when Saddam has served his purpose, and you have, the 2003 invasion. But the point is that, these sort of hostilities between the two have been building for a long time, and it's about, they frame it as being, about Shia and Sunni, but obviously it's just about flexing your, regional power and being able to have a sort of hegemony, across the region. And so you see that in the latest instance being Yemen, where again you have the Houthis who are quote unquote being, backed, according to the West, by Iran militarily, but Iran claims it's just, they politically support their interests, and they not, supply them with any sort of weapons or military aid. And then you have the GCC and the Saudi coalition. And I think it's important at this point to understand that the Saudi coalition, who've been actively bombarding Yemen for 5 years or even more so, inside Yemen, you have the infrastructure, any sort of humanitarian infrastructure, whether it was schools, sanitation plants, power plants, hospitals, everything decimated by the coalition. And who's sort of facilitating them? It's the UK and the US. You have the US who are providing, not just logistical support in terms of having, telling them, what sort of targets you can or cannot hit, but also providing at first they were providing refueling, mid-air refueling for coalition forces, so they can continuously bomb, that they don't even have to stop in terms of refueling and then coming back. They can just have this continuous never-ending bombardment campaign, and that's what we've seen. And then you have obviously the fact that the UK and US have facilitated any sort of weaponry that the Saudis use, and it's it extends beyond this sort of logistical support. It's about arming Saudi Arabia so they can carry out their atrocities. And when you have a country, and that a country is being destroyed, where every sort of infrastructural, capacity that provides people with care and provides people with basically the ability to be able to survive these sort of devastating moments, is actively being sought out. Like, they're literally targeting those sites that are providing care for people, and you're still backing them, you're still facilitating them, you're still providing them with the weaponry, with the jets, with the tanks, to that possible. You can't look at this moment and what's happened to Yemen, where it's the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and just say this is a catastrophe, this is horrible, this is something that's just happened, and then say where do we go on from there. We have to know that our Western governments are complicit in facilitating this destruction, right? And from what I've read, it's actually horrifying. The fact that in the past couple of years, I think it was 2 or 3 billion pounds worth of sales of fighter jets and missiles to the Saudis via the British, which is, it's crazy, the fact that that Saudi Arabia at the moment, they have more fighter jets, than British-made fighter jets than the British military have
Military.
themselves.
Crazy, crazy.
And so it's nothing more than an atrocious situation. And we have to really see it in that context. We can't just look at it as something that happened out of nowhere.
100%, bro. You just perfectly kind of summarized 50, 60 years of like Middle Eastern like politic history in like less than or just over 10 minutes. That's incredible. I
Yeah,
think I learned like more in this like talk than I've ever learned by just being in a lecture. So I want to just say thank you, man. That was amazing, bro. I did not know about the like the points where you made about the 50s and 60s and the 2003 takeover, etc. That's incredible, and you're very right
yeah,
about our own governments assisting Saudi Arabia in carrying out these catastrophes. And I only really learned about the UK's involvement I think last year or the year before, when I think
yeah.
someone in Parliament asked the Prime Minister why they're doing this, and this should
Mm,
be stopped because they're killing
yeah.
innocent people. So
Mhm,
it's really brought it to light. And I think for us, our responsibility as not even just Muslims, but here in the UK, as people that want to live in a society that's equal for our children and it's safe,
mhm.
we need to really apply pressure and just question why the
Definitely.
UK is actually doing this. I think
Yeah.
hasn't Canada been involved in this too, or that's something
Yeah,
else?
yeah. So they have, right? So there's this misconception, about Canada and sort of the role that it plays in the world. I think it's important to understand that the Canadian government and the way it functions abroad is way more sinister and low key
Mm-hmm.
than say the US or the UK or France or whatever, right? A
Okay.
lot of Western powers are more apparent in how they sort of interfere and deal with foreign governments, but the
Okay.
Canadian government isn't any different, because one, it has a long history of a lot of Canadian mining companies abroad. They've been actively supporting regime change and just
Okay.
committing these mass atrocities that have destroyed our planet. But the politically, especially in the case of what's happening in Yemen right now, Canada they brokered a deal in 2014 where they were
Mm-hmm.
selling what the government told us at the time were these armored jeeps, right? And they said, oh, they're for transport, and we're just selling them to the Saudis. And back
Mm-hmm.
then, obviously, there really wasn't any outcry around what Saudi Arabia does. Not a lot of people really knew much about Saudi Arabia either, right?
Right.
So these are post Mohammed bin Salman days,
Mm-hmm.
and Saudi has been very low key in how they also, conduct their own sort of regional aggressions, and then their own, domestic sort of policing against
Right.
especially the Shia minority in, I believe it's the South. So Canada brokers this deal that they're going to be manufacturing and selling them these Jeeps. So I believe it was around 2015-16, after we had our elections, you had the Conservative Party who had brokered the deal going out of power, and you had the
Mm-hmm.
Liberals with Justin Trudeau coming into power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Justin Trudeau ran his campaign, and he sort of promised this refresh in terms of Canadian politics that hadn't really happened in the last 15 years. But
Right.
again, it's the case, as is the case with most neoliberal sort of figureheads. It's all talk, right? And we see the
Right.
same thing with Obama,
Yep.
as we see with him. And he's really not changed much. And in terms of this deal, he started making excuses at first that this is providing a lot of jobs in the region. That the the factories and the plants where it's going to be manufactured in southern Ontario. It's been devastated by the last recession. So, locally, this is something that's going to be helping working class, predominantly white people. So we need to, have this, and we have all this intelligence showing that nothing is really, happening with how the Saudis are making use of this. But then fast forward to 2017-18, you have this sudden uproar, and I'll get to the part as to why exactly, but just there's a shift. We see the atrocities that are happening in Yemen coming to the forefront in the mainstream finally, and you suddenly have people in the West taking interest, and they're wondering what sort of roles their own governments are playing. If the Americans are facilitating and refueling their jets, what role is the UK playing? What role is Canada playing? And so around this time, it became a big thing in the U.S. And I believe it was Congress where they debated this, and they passed this resolution that said that they no longer can the American military refuel these jets or provide the sort of logistical support as they were before. And you would think that they would stop, but what they at the time did was they came up with this list, and they said all we're doing is we're providing the Saudis with this list of what not to bomb. And this had schools, hospitals, sanitation plants and whatnot that they've already bombed for the last 2-3 years. They've absolutely decimated Yemen at this point in 2017-18. You already have the most basic infrastructure in the country evaporating because of this, right? You have much of the casualties and the sort of everything's brewed to a point where it's beyond help. And then you have the Canadian government coming under a lot of distress and criticism, because they too are supplying them with these so-called armored vehicles that were then pictured by various news sources as being used on the southern border, and chances are across the border in Yemen as well, to transport not just Saudi personnel, but also weaponry and whatnot. And so since then you've had this back and forth between the Canadian government and just popular organizations, and people calling them out saying you need to stop this, and the government being like, okay, we're going to stop it, but then nothing really happening. Late last year you had Justin Trudeau finally kind of actively giving in to the criticism, saying, okay, this is atrocious and we need to stop. Now, it's important at this moment to, kind of contextualize, as I'm sure you've seen in the UK, that in the past year and a half, 2 years, you've seen a sudden shift in how the media deals with Saudi Arabia, but in particular Mohammed bin Salman. And you have, say the takeover of Newcastle United, right, going on at the moment. And you see him in the spotlight. You see all this barrage of, criticism and limelight around him, and what sort of personality he is, and that he's done all this stuff in Yemen, but particularly, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, right? And after that was like the watershed moment for a lot of Western people. They were like, oh, now we suddenly have to speak up, because it's so apparent, like the violence that a lot of us have. Obviously, obviously Saudi Arabia have always been this brutal, and we've known it, right, against their own population and against dissidents and the royal family, members of the royal family. They've always been doing this sort of stuff, but it really shocked the Western world, and you suddenly see this shift where people are starting to call out Saudi in the mainstream. And it's pretty hypocritical, actually, I would say, at that point, because have a history of, American, American and even British military forces where they've not just assassinated or targeted journalists in war zones like Iraq or like Serbia in the 90s, but you have actually one particular Yemeni journalist. I forgot his name. I think it was like Abdullah something, who in 2009 there was this bombing, right? So the U.S. had been bombarding, or not bombarding, but just doing these covert type of operations against, terrorist organizations and what they call Al Qaeda in Yemen and North Africa.
Yeah.
And they were, doing consistent raids and bombings of these specific targeted areas. And in one instance, they actually bombed this Bedouin village, and they did it knowingly because it was under the suspicion that there was this, terrorist leader there. And this came out into the through I believe it was WikiLeaks at the time or something, but it came out in the media, and you had certain Western journalists picking it up because it was reported by this famous Yemeni journalist who collaborated with a lot of British and American newspapers, and so this guy essentially exposed the covert sort of drone operation. It's under Obama, which was he conducted this kill list, and it was like a targeted drone program where in Yemen, Somalia, as well as Pakistan, Afghanistan, they were bombing these sort of individuals and their families, in fact, right? And so he exposes them, and then Obama makes a call to Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was actually still the leader of Yemen in, I believe, like 2010-11, and he says, that at that point, this journalist had been arrested under, I don't know, it was like supporting terrorism or something, right? Some ludicrous sort of claim. And Obama actually stressed to him, and the call was like leaked through WikiLeaks, stressing that, it wouldn't be a great idea. He didn't say it blatantly, but he suggested that it wouldn't be a great idea if this journalist was released, right? And so you have that guy, I believe he's still under house arrest. He spent like 5-6 more years in jail, being tortured and absolutely brutalized, and he's still under house arrest. But it's this interesting dichotomy, right, where you have no one focusing on what Obama did there, or this journalist for calling out a mass atrocity, but then you have someone like Jamal Khashoggi, who around a year and a half before his death was, he was like an inside man in terms of being so close to the Saudi royal family. And at that point, he kind of switches allegiances. He goes to the US. He starts criticizing Saudi Arabia, and then he's unfortunately killed. And obviously, we should hold them accountable. We should criticize the Saudi regime, but I think it's, it's part of this sort of history of Orientalist thinking, where the Western population and the mainstream, they like to, point out and center people, especially in the Arab world, but the Muslim world, as being, kind of backwards and violent and just inherently like devious in terms of how they conduct themselves. So it kind of fueled that rhetoric that we've seen for decades, if not centuries. But it was at that point where then again you have all these Western governments coming under criticism for their role, and you have campaigns in the UK criticizing Theresa May's government for the way that they've done business with the Saudis, despite what they've been doing there. You have Bernie Sanders, as well as there was this I believe he's a Senator, Ro Khanna, from
Okay.
California, who tabled this motion, and it was debated for months and months that they should, stop aiding, giving military aid to the Saudis because of what they're doing in Yemen. And then at the end of 2019, right before COVID, you have them finally, passing that. So, there has been a shift in terms of how Western governments, Western media has been looking at Yemen, but the damage is done, right? I mean,
Damage is done.
it's obliterated. You still have that, sort of air and naval blockade that's not allowing any sort of humanitarian aid coming into
Goodness
the
gracious.
country. You
Hmm.
have people dying of cholera in the millions, like millions
Yeah,
are under, right? Be it from cholera, something that didn't even exist in the world for the past nearly 100 years, right? And now
exactly. Yeah,
it's resurfacing. You have famine, which is affecting, it was like, what, 20 million people?
almost 20.
And
Yeah,
yeah, and then you have on top of it, coronavirus, which is just going to
coronaviruses.
make things absolutely even more horrifying.
Exactly. It's like the nail on the coffin, almost. COVID. It's like, okay,
Exactly.
things
Yeah,
gonna get any worse now. You have COVID, which is gonna potentially gonna wipe the whole country off the map, which is such a scary thought. I would have
yes,
never imagined that could happen. But you've just run through
absolutely,
everything that's happened, and
absolutely.
you've kind of just seen what the state is. That's crazy, and I think
Mhm.
it's up to us to just like keep on having these conversations, keep on holding our governments accountable, as you stated, because
Definitely.
these guys can practically run free with what they're doing, and they have been for the past couple of years. What type of
Yeah.
organizations do you think we should be supporting? Because I've tried to donate to UNICEF. People are like, no, don't donate to UNICEF. They don't do anything. What's your take on that? Because as you stated, a lot of
Yeah.
the
So,
stuff is
yeah. So I was actually having this discussion with a friend, who's based in the U.S., but she's Yemeni, and she has family on the ground, who obviously, I guess, they're in a relatively privileged position where, they can kind of not only distribute relief funds and materials and supplies, but
sure.
they know of local organizations. And it's I think it's important to, well, you have, well-known, like, organizations like even Islamic Relief and stuff
Yeah.
like that, who are the ground. What tends to happen with a lot of these larger, international based, where they aren't locally based, organizations, is that they literally cannot reach Yemen because of the air
That's correct.
naval blockade. Like, you cross the border, or even come near the shoreline in any way. So
Yeah.
what think and I could be wrong, but what I have been led to believe is the most, fundamentally constructive way of helping Yemeni people at the moment is by donating money. And this money is funneled to, local organizers, and people on the ground who not
Yeah.
only understand the dynamics of the situation, but they know how to get the supplies to where it's needed the most. And so there have been a few that I've been recommended, but you mainly they're, through people and who have family there, and friends and
Hmm.
acquaintances who can money, they can get supplies, and they can get it to, the worst affected areas. But yeah, you have to be, kind of cognizant of how you're essentially aiding through international, or like the bigger, larger organizations, because there is, this history of where it doesn't really, they can't really deliver,
Yeah.
funds and aid supplies to war affected areas.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think I remember reading a story either this year or starter when they near the end of last year where they literally had like piles of boxes full of rice and other stuff just like
Mm-hmm.
sitting in storage in Yemen because they couldn't even
Mm-hmm.
reach the places. So it just goes to show.
Exactly, because yeah, I mean, yeah, like the supply lines, like basic things, like just roads and whatever sort of, transportation infrastructure you had is been wiped out, and so you can't even have adequate distribution of materials. So it's beyond horrifying, and it's terrible.
Yeah. And as you stated, donating money, putting your money where your mouth is, where we can pray.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course, praying is integral, but now it's time to like put our money where our mouth is and really, really try to focus on, like you said, the key organizations which know how to navigate around the area. But this was heavy, man.
Mm-hmm.
You went through everything from, like the history of how everything started from the, Arab Spring, how they toppled the dictator Salah, to all the way to the allegiance, the Saudi coalition, and also a bit of history between Iran and also Saudi, and how Western governments such as the UK, specifically Theresa May's government, and also the US and Canada are all playing their parts in, what could be led to wiping off Yemen off the planet. Crazy. Well, I pray with everyone on the ground.
And I think I just want to stress in this moment, like, if you're listening to this podcast, please, if you're in the UK, US, Canada, it doesn't matter where you are, reach out to your local representatives and pressure them, send emails, phone in, whatever it is, in order to, stress to them the grave situation that's going on in Yemen, so they can apply pressure through those diplomatic means as well, to not just get aid and supplies there, but to really, hold Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Council accountable for, their horrifying actions there.
100%, I agree with that, and I second that. And definitely, it's very easy for us here in the UK to just write to our representatives. I know my local MP, and we have so many easy systems in place to just write about our issues. With the recent Black Lives Matter movement, I wrote and he replied, and I'll be doing the same in regards to obviously the UK's involvement in providing logistics and resources, etc. But man, thank you so much for coming on, sharing some of your wisdom. I feel like I've read like 10 textbooks. You are so knowledgeable, bro. Honestly, thank you, man.
Thank you. I think you just need to be, right. I mean, that's the time we're living in. It's either you learn or you're gonna. I mean, silence isn't an option, right? We can't be silent. We can't be indifferent or apathetic to these instances. So we really need to educate ourselves and others, and just keep carrying forward with the most optimism that we can have.
100%. That's why I wanted to have you on, because I know you have, you have knowledge that you can share with people such as myself. I didn't know as much as you know, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people will benefit from this, that will listen, because you've condensed the information so precisely, and just provided such a good overview. Where can the people find you if they don't know you already? And this is like your plug time. Plug your
So you can follow me on Instagram at Dialectics of Liberation. You can follow me on Twitter at Dialectic Hip Hop, or just search me up, Dialectic, on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you're streaming music, and find my music there.
Perfect. Look out for Dialect, because he's about to go crazy with not just the music, everything else. Thank you so much for coming on, bro. I really appreciate you doing this, man.
I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, man. Thank you.
Bro, anytime. And we could probably talk for hours about this, but I didn't want to, overdo it. I wanted to just get the right amount of information, and I'm super thankful that you were the person that I had the opportunity to speak with. So I'm very thankful, bro. Thank you so much.